All right, I think we're good. All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. I know it's a bit rainy outside, so I appreciate you making the trek to Olin tonight. I'm sure you're all very busy with prelims too, so extra thank you for still showing up. Today we're going to be talking about persistence. And so to give you a little introduction about myself, my name is Reed. I am the iOS lead here at Cornell App Dev. I joined Cornell App Dev in fall of 2019. Some of the apps I worked on include our app called Eatery, Course Grab, Pair, and Scooped. I've also worked at Apple building apps, so if you have any questions about building apps in the industry, feel free to come up to me after lecture. But yeah, let's jump right on in. So what is persistence? Essentially, this is the way we can store data in our app, right? And so I think you're all familiar with how we store data in variables. We can store strings and ints. We want to store data that actually persists across different launches of our app, right? So if I, make a variable called, read, and then I can open the app again and it'll still be there. So persistence kind of tackles how to do that. Before I go further, I do want to mention that we do have lecture notes on everything I'll be covering today. So these are in the course textbook. As well, there is some starter code, as I will be giving a demo on how we implement persistence as well. So feel free to download this and work alongside me. And if you have any questions at any point, feel free to raise your hand and I can stop and answer them. Cool. Let's jump right in. So there are 5 main ways we can achieve persistence that I'll be covering today. The first way is called user defaults. So for each of these topics, I'll be giving you a little bit of an overview and then doing a demo on how we can save data and retrieve data using these methods. So the first method is called user defaults. The next method we'll talk about is called Keychain. Next, we'll talk about the file system. Then we'll talk about property lists. And then finally, we'll wrap up by talking about a cool Apple library called Core Data. Cool. Any questions up until this point? Awesome. All right, let's jump right on in. So we'll start by talking about user defaults. So what is user defaults? Essentially, it's a lightweight and easy way we can store small amounts of data in our app. So what does this mean? Say, for example, I have an app that has dark mode and light mode. If I open the app, let's say it's on default light mode. Let's say I go into my app settings and toggle it to dark mode. I want to save that setting somewhere on my phone so that I don't have to keep going back into the app and toggling back to dark mode every time my app launches. User defaults is a great way to do that. We can store things like user preferences for our app settings, really anything we want. The key with user defaults is usually the values we store are strings, ints, doubles, booleans. For that dark mode example, I'd probably store, have some key called light mode and have it be equal to true or false and store that boolean. But what's key here is these should really be small data types we're using. Essentially, we can store data using basically a dictionary. I think you all learned about dictionaries as well. So we have a key for our data, and then we have a value for that key that we can pass in. So in the case of the dark mode example, my key would be, is dark mode enabled, and then my value would be true or false. Something really important to note is that we should never store sensitive information in user defaults. And the reason we don't do this is because any data you put into user defaults is not encrypted. So storing things like passwords, authentication tokens, credentials, credit card numbers, if you store that, theoretically, any hacker that gets your phone can access that data. So it's never a good idea to store sensitive data in user defaults. And then for the implementation of user defaults, essentially, we're going to access it using a standard shared instance. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So hopefully you've all had time to get the starter code if you want to follow along. It should look like this. So basically, I'll give you a rundown of what we're looking at here. So I have 5 examples here: a user default example, a keychain example, basically one for every method we'll talk about today. And then I separated the logic for getting data and saving data inside an object of this example. So if we navigate here to user default example, this is where we're going to implement the save data method and get data method for user defaults. Any questions about the code base or starter code? Cool. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to first start by showing you how we can save data inside user defaults. So I'll start. Is this big enough, everyone? Can everyone see this? Cool. I'll start by typing user defaults, and then I will access what's called a shared instance. It's called standard. And then I will call a function called set. And so this function takes in, it takes in a value of any type, and it also takes in a key, that's a string. So for example, I could do is dark mode enabled, and then we could do true. We can also pass in other types of data. So we can do, or actually, sorry, I'll just do a, so there's actually two. If you want to set a Boolean for user defaults, you want to do set value. Sorry. I think that should work. No, it's good. We'll just make it a string for now, just for the sake of the demo. Let's say true. And then we can also set different types. So I can use your defaults, that's standard, that's set. Let's do, I don't know. Oh, actually, you're totally right. It is switched. My bad. Set true for key is dark mode enabled. Okay, cool. All right, next we'll do a different data type. So let's do set. Does anyone have a lucky number they want to share? Just call it out. 7. Okay, we'll do 7 for our lucky number. All right, cool. Cool. So now we're storing a Boolean and we're storing an integer. You can also store, strings, characters, arrays. But this is good for this example. Cool. So now let's write the function to actually get this data, right? So we have this user defaults, we pass some data, and theoretically, next time we launch the app, we should be able to retrieve this data from user defaults. To do that, we'll create a variable. Let's call it, dark mode enabled. And we'll set this equal to user defaults.standard. And then we're going to retrieve that Boolean. So we'll type bool for key, and then we'll pass in is dark mode enabled. And then let's do the same thing for our lucky number. So we'll do let lucky number equal user defaults dot standard dot, we'll do integer for key. And sorry, this lucky number here, ideally our key should be, one word with the first letter lowercase, so lucky number. Just change that. And then just pass in lucky number. Cool. So there's different ways of accessing different data types. Here we use bool for key. Here we use integer for key. We can also, if we don't know the type of the value we're accessing, we could also use what's called user defaults dot value for key. However, we have to cast this to some sort of value. As you can see, this function here returns any value. So if we want to actually do anything with it, we have to cast to a string or integer. So you'd have to do that casting as well. These just provide kind of quicker ways to do that if we know that the value will be of type Boolean or type integer. Cool. And then we can just kind of print, these values. So print dark mode enabled, print lucky number. Cool. Any questions with anything I just wrote there? All right, let's run our app now and see if this works. So ideally, if we go back to our view controller, we want to uncomment this example because we're going to run these two functions, right? So we're going to run this function called run user default example. And then within this function, we're going to run save data, which should save our data to user defaults, and then get data, which should get data back from user defaults and print it to the console. So if we run our app and look at our console, we should see true and 7. So nowhere did I actually print like directly, true or 7 or those values. We're simply getting them from this kind of like black box, right? And that's these are defaults. And so if I, for example, went back to the view controller, and let's say I didn't save that data. Let's say I commented out save data. So we're just getting the data. We still get those values back. So it's being saved somewhere on our device, not directly just in the context of our code base. Cool. All right, I'm going to comment back out that run default example and then set up by running our run keychain example. And let's move over into Keychain. Before I do so, any questions about user defaults or its implementation for getting and retrieving data? Cool. Is everyone following along? Am I going too fast or good? Cool. All right. I already did the demo. Let's talk about Keychain. So what is Keychain? Essentially, this is a secure storage system to store our data. So it's great for storing sensitive information. So things like passwords, authentication tokens, credentials are really good for Keychain. Its implementation is as follows. So first, we'll create what's called a query. And then to save data, we will add that query to the Keychain. And then to retrieve data, we will return the data from that query. And so it's kind of abstract, maybe a little hard to follow, but we'll kind of show how it works in a demo here as well. So if I go back to my code, we've already uncommented run Keychain example. And so again, this is going to be calling the functions to save and get data. So I'll go over to my Keychain example file here. And so it looks a little different. I'll kind of give you a rundown of what's happening here. So we start by basically Keychain requires 2 strings. It requires a service string and an account string. It doesn't matter so much what you call these. In this case, I called the security service and then the account password. So let's start by saving data. So does anyone want to share their password they want to save? It can be a fake password. Yeah. Okay. Let password equal I love Shingo. All right, so that's our password we're going to save. It's a string right now, so you probably want to get this input from a text field or something, but we'll just give it a string now, or a variable. So next step is to encode this password into our data. So we can't pass the string directly into Keychain. We have to encode it into data first. So we do that by running, we'll make a variable here called data, and we'll do password dot data using, and you pass in your encoding method here. So we're going to use UTF-8. Next, we're going to create our query. So we'll do let query equals, it's going to be a dictionary. So what's nice is that Keychain has keys already kind of written for you. So you get to pass in the keys and the values. I'll show you that right here in a second. So our first key here is going to be called ksec value data. And so this key basically represents the data that we're going to save in our keychain. So in our case, it's the data we created from our password. We'll pass in the data. The next key we're going to add is called ksec class. So this key tells you basically what the type of the data is being used. In our case, we're saving a password. And so Keychain has a type for this called ksec class generic password. Next, we're going to pass in our service string and our account string. And we do that by passing in ksec attribute service. Be careful not to use server. There's 2 options here. We're going to use service. And then we'll pass in our service string. And then we're also going to pass in our account string. So we do this by typing ksec or ksec attribute account. And we pass in our account. And so the final step here is we have to cast this dictionary to what's called a CF dictionary. You don't have to worry so much about what that is right now. That is the type we have to pass in. Cool. And then you'll see here, I'm getting a little warning here saying expression implicitly course from data, an optional data to any. This is because when we encode the password, the encoding could fail and return nil. We're going to assume it doesn't do that. We're going to force and wrap this. Typically, you want to check this using a guard let if let statement before you force and wrap it. But we'll just force and wrap it so we get rid of that warning here. Great. So then next, we are going to add this query to our keychain. And so when we do that, Keychain will return a status code to us. And this status code can either be successful or bad, right? It can return a success or failure. And we store the status code in a variable we'll call status. So we'll do status equal, and then we call our function to add the item to our keychain. It's called sec item add. And then here it's asking for that dictionary path we created. So we'll pass in the query, and then we'll pass in, we're going to pass in nil for this other option. Cool. So finally, the next step is to basically check if this status was successful or not. So we can do if status is not equal to ERR success. This is basically the successful status code. So if we're not getting the successful status code back, we know something went wrong, and then we can just print the status code and see what the error is. Cool. So to summarize what we did here, to save data to keychain, essentially we got our password or whatever credential we're trying to save. We encoded that data or coded that password into data. We passed that data into a query, added that query to our keychain, and then checked if we have a successful add through our status code. Cool. Next, let's get the data back, right? So we added to keychain. Now let's get it back. Any questions so far with adding items to keychain? Cool. All right. So to get data back, essentially we have to create a query. So I think it's a little faster to copy and paste the query we already have, since we're not going to change it too much. Paste that. And there's only one thing to change. Instead of passing in data, we're going to tell the query to return data. So to do that, I'm going to replace this ksec value data with something called ksec return data. And I'm going to pass in true. This basically tells my query that I want to return data from the keychain. Next, I'm going to create a result object. This will be of any type, any object. And then I'm going to basically get my query from keychain. So to do that, I'll type let status, because we're also getting a status code back here as well. Equal sec item copy matching. I'm going to pass in my query here. I shouldn't go. And then I'm going to pass in my result that I created up here. But instead of passing in directly my result, I'm going to do something kind of interesting here. I'm going to do and result. So this is basically passing it in by reference. Oh, sorry, this should be, my bad, this should be a bar here. Cool. Is everyone up to speed so far? Cool. All right. Next, we can just, check if that status code is, equal to our successful status code like we did above. If not, we can just print, error, whatever. But what's really important here is if we get a successful status code back, we can now get our data back. And so we can do this by writing let data equal result as data. And then next what we can do is we can basically, before we encoded a string into data, now we can decode data back into a string. And we can do that using a string constructor called data. So I'll pass in my data here, and then we'll pass in the method we used to encode it, which was UTF-8. And then finally, I'm just going to print the string back to the console so we know that it was the right value. Cool. So essentially what we did here is we created a query, passed that query along with an object into a keychain, and that keychain returned data back to that object, which we decoded back into our string, and then we printed the string out to the user. And then here, again, I'm getting this little warning here because when we decode, something could go wrong. So it's really an optional string we get back, but we'll force unwrap it just to avoid that warning for now. Cool. Let's try running this. So I should see in the console my password print. Cool. Actually, no, this is basically what happened here is it should print correctly for you, but because I already passed in a value to this keychain, my password before was appdev for life. Haha. I'm getting an error back. I'm getting this error code, and it's also printing my old password. So the reason it's doing that is because when you try to update values in Keychain that already exist, it doesn't work. So in this case, I had a password I saved called appdev for life. It's my password I use for everything, so don't copy it. But I tried to update that value with this new password, and it didn't work because you can't override values in Keychain that already exist. Before you do that, you must first delete the value and then add the new value in. And that's why if you scroll down here, you'll see I already include this delete function here. Just for the sake of time, I didn't want to write this from scratch, but it's kind of similar to what we did before. We create a query, pass it into this function called item delete, and then, if there's any error handling, we do that. But in my case, since I now want to save this new password, I want to first delete the data that's already there. So if I do this and now run it, we should see that my new password is there and I get no error code. Again, to reemphasize that, if I don't delete the data and try to change my password, hello world, I should see an error code come in and my old password there. And basically this error code is telling us that that password can't be updated because there already exists a value in Keychain at that location. Cool. So that's Keychain. Any questions with how we use that and why we use it? Cool. All right. Next, let's jump into the file system. So the file system is great for storing large pieces of data. So this is, great for things like audio files, images, videos, etc. The implementation of this, I believe you learned about URLs on Monday. So we're going to use some of that in this example as well. We create a URL that points to where we want to store our data in our file system. And then to save data, we simply write to that URL. And to retrieve data, we simply fetch data from that URL. Any questions to that? Cool. So I'll show you how that kind of works now in code. So I'll go over back to my example here. And then if I go to my view controller, I'll comment out my run keychain example, and I'll comment out my run file system example. Then I can come over to my file system example file here. And we're going to implement two methods to save data to the file system and retrieve data to the file system. So first, to save data, I'll start by creating my URL. So I'll call this URL. And this will be equal to the file manager. So something cool about Swift or Xcode is if you're ever unsure about what something is, if you just type out a little bit of what the name is, it sometimes gives you a little description here. So file manager, a convenient interface the contents of the file system and the primary means of interacting with it. Just a little helpful tip there. And then we access the default instance of the file manager. And then we can get the URLs. And so in here, we're going to pass in what's called the document directory. And then here, we're going to pass in the user domain mask. So this returns an array of URLs. We're going to access the first URL in that array. So we'll type first. And then we'll add a path. We'll add a path component. So appending path. Here we go. Appending path component. There are a few appending path. There's a appending path extension. So make sure you have a appending path component here. And then we'll pass in our string. So this is the name of the data we want to save. So for example, in this example, I'll create a text file. And I'll call this mydata.txt. And we can set its directory to false because it's a file and not a directory. So this line it's kind of a lot going on in this line. Basically what we're doing here is we are using the file manager to interact with our file system on our phone. And then we're getting the URL for the documents directory that corresponds with our app inside the user's home directory. Once we have that URL, that location, we're adding our data file to that location. So we're adding a new file called mydata.txt to the documents directory for this app. A little complicated. Are there any questions with that? Yeah.
When typing appending path component, there's a warning saying it'll be
deprecated. Yeah, you can ignore that for now. We are not bleeding edge here at Intro to iOS. So some of the functions we use are a little outdated. But I'm sure if you wanted to, you could look up an alternative. They probably provide an alternative function you could use. Since that is deprecated and probably won't work in a few years from now. Cool. So next, let's save some text to this this file here. So I'll do let's string equals hello world. I love iOS. Great. So it's really simple to write this to our file. We simply once again we encode this into data like we did before. So we do let data equals string.data using UTF-8 encoding. And then we're going to try to write this data to our URL. So we will type try data.write to URL. I'll pass in our URL there. Don't worry so much about what this try statement does. You learn more about it if you like took 1110 or 2110, learn about exceptions, but you don't have to worry about it for the sake of this class right now. So essentially what we're doing here is we're creating a URL. We're passing a string that's encoded into data. We're creating a URL and we are making a string, encoding that data, and then writing that data to the URL. And that's basically how we store information in the file system. To retrieve information, to get that data back, it's a very similar process. We once again need our URL. So I'll just copy this URL here. And then we can basically just get the data directly from it. So we can do let data equals try data, and then contents of URL. And then we can, like we did before, decode this data back into our string. So we can do that string equals string data, pass in our data, and then we use UTF-8 encoding, and then we can print that string. So you kind of see a pattern here, right? We have some raw data type, like a string, integer, Boolean. We encode that into a data object, which looks like this here. And then we pass that data into our file manager, or into our keychain. And then here I'm also going to force my wrap again, just to hide that warning. Cool. So now if I run this code, I should see hello world, I love iOS print to the screen. So let's try it. Cool. Looks like it prints here. That means we have successfully saved data to the file manager and retrieved data back from the file manager. Any questions with that? Cool. Let's move on to the next method of storing data. Yeah. Oh yeah, sure, of course. We'll also post the final code afterward as well, so you'll have access to all this. What? And the recording too, yes. Cool. All right, so great. We've covered user defaults, we covered keychain, covered the file system. Let's talk about the fourth way we can store data in our app and implement persistence across app launches. And that's called property lists. So property lists are another lightweight way to, store data that is a bit more complex. So this includes things like arrays and dictionaries. You could technically store these in user defaults or in file system or in keychain, but property lists makes this really easy to do. And the implementation is as such. So once again, we create a URL that points to a property list location. So we want to store this property list. And then we save data by serializing that property list into data. And then we retrieve data by serializing data back into our property list. So I'll go over that again in code, so it's a little more concrete. But for now, let's go back to our example, jump over to our view controller. We'll comment out our run file system example, and then we'll comment out our run property list example. If I go to our property list example file now, I have two more functions here to save data and get data. So if you already have URL from file manager or file system copied to your clipboard, feel free to paste that. We're going to use the exact same code. The only thing we're going to change here, instead of .txt, we're going to do .plist. So instead of saving this as a text file, we're saving this as a plist file. So property lists are really dictionaries. So we can create a dictionary to represent the data we want to store. So here I'll create a dictionary. It'll be of type string for our keys. Oops. And then any type for our objects. So we can put booleans, strings, anything we want in this dictionary for each key. So I'll just put, my name. And then I'll put my lucky number, which is 27. Keep that a secret. And then does anyone have anything else you want to put in? We can put anything we want into our dictionary. Anything anyone wants to save? Alden, any data you want to save? Anything that's been on your mind lately that you want to save in our dictionary? Birthday. Okay. Antoinette's birthday. B-Day. What is your birthday?
March 17th.
March 17th. That's St. Patrick's Day too. All right, March 17th. Cool. No. We could though. You could, but you have to format and stuff. It'd be annoying. Cool. So now we're going to serialize this property list into our data. So we'll get back a data type, a data object for this. So we'll call that data, and we'll do try property list serialization dot data. Here it's asking for our property list, so we'll pass in that dictionary we created. The format we're going to use is called .xml. It's basically a way you can express data If you're familiar with JSON, it's a little like that. But don't worry about that too much. And then for options, we're going to just put 0. And then like we saw with the file system, we're going to just write this data to this URL. So we'll do try data.write to URL. And that's it. That's all we do. To get data, also a very similar process to what we saw in the file system example. We can copy our URL. We can get our data from this URL. Oops, sorry, it should be try data contents of URL. From this data, we can serialize this data back into our property list. So we'll call this dictionary, and then we'll do try property list serialization dot property list from data, and then we'll pass in the data we created up there. And then we can ignore format, we'll pass in nil for format. And then we want to cast this as a dictionary, the dictionary type we created above, so string any. Cool. And then finally, the last step is, now we have our dictionary, so we can just print the values in the dictionary. So we can print name, we can print lucky number, and then we can also print Antoinette's birthday. So make sure your keys are the exact same as up here. Otherwise, you won't be indexing into your dictionary properly. And yeah, these are going to be all optional, so we can just, force them, most of them as optionals now. So if we run this code, we should see all those values print to our terminal. We do. So we read 27 and March 17th. So that means we have successfully saved data to a property list that's stored into the file manager and retrieve that data. Yeah.
There's no status code this time?
Nope. There's no status code. All the status codes are used for error handling for Keychain. All of the error handling you would do in a file manager is coming from these try statements. So really, like, what I'm doing here is, have you used try statements before, like do catch? So really the better way to write this would be do let data equals try data contents of URL. And then if that fails, we would catch some error and then print the error and some description of the error. And that's how we do error handling for this. A little bit out of scope for what I want to show you today, but definitely very useful if you're doing this in a real app. You definitely want to have some sort of error handling going on there. I'll also just comment it out. I'll keep it in the code though, in case you are interested. Cool. Any other questions? No? All right. So it looks like we ended at 25 or 30. Yeah, cool. So it looks like I have like about 5 minutes to teach you about core data, which is super cool. Core data is essentially a library that is used for storing very large, complex data models. Basically, previously we worked in, storing data in like dictionaries or the Keychain, your defaults. You can think of core data as like a database that lives entirely on your phone. And so it basically provides an object-oriented interface to an SQLite database engine. If you don't know what OOP means, it basically means like we're using classes and structures and creating objects from these classes and structures to access this data in SQLite. Very useful for saving and retrieving large amounts of structured data. And the implementation for this looks like this. So first, we have to create what's called an entity to represent our data. Then we have to create what's called a managed object context. I'll talk a little more about what this is in the demo. To save data, we want to create a new managed context for the entity we want to update. And then to retrieve data, we want to execute a request on that managed context. So again, kind of vague. It will materialize once we go through the demo. So I'll start by going back to my project here. And then I'll go to my view controller. I'll comment out property list example and run my core data example. And then here I have my core data class. You'll notice that actually at the very bottom here, I have something called model. And this is what our entity looks like. So when you're using core data, you actually don't store your data in like structures or classes. You store in this thing called an entity. And core data provides a whole user interface for building these entities. So here I have an entity called book. And its attributes are an author of type string, an ID of type UUID, a page count of type integer, published, which is a date, and title, which is a string. So what's really cool here is you can really kind of pick what data type you want to use. And you can use things like dates. And dates actually a very complex data type. So the fact that we can use it here so seamlessly is very convenient. And you can add attributes, delete attributes. You can also have relationships to other entities. So for example, if this book was part of a series, I could make a series entity and have a relationship with that series. There's a whole lot that you can do with entities in core data. But let's go into how we save data and get data with core data. So the first step is we have to get our object context. And so down here, you'll see a function I already wrote called get object context. And so this basically returns the managed object context I was talking about in the slides that'll be used for getting our data. We have to access our app delegate. And then within our app delegate, we access something called the persistent container. What this does is it provides access to core data and its stack. And then once we have that access, we can get something called the view context, which basically allows us to run core data operations like saving and fetching data from the user interface. So you kind of think this is like a bridge between the database and our UI. What's really important to note that every time we update or create a new entity, we must save the context again. And I'll show you how to do that right now. So first, we want to get the context. So we'll do let context equal get object context. Then we'll create an entity. So we'll do let entity equal ns entity description. We'll pass the name of our entity in, so book, and then we'll pass in the context. For the sake of time, I'm just gonna kind of write this a little faster. So then we'll create a book object. We'll call this an ns managed object. We pass in the entity, and then we pass in our context. And then once we have the book created, we can set its value. So here I can do book.setValue. We can do out of the catcher in the RAI, for key the title. We can also set the title or set the author, set the page count. For time's sake, I'll just set the title for now. And the last step is once we create the new entity, we're going to save the context. So try context, .save. Cool. Again, here you could do like some error handling with a do catch statement, but we'll just keep it like this for now. Cool. So basically, get the context, get the entity, create a new object from that entity, set the values for the object, and then save the context. Let's get the data back now. So we'll do context equals get object context. To get data back from core data, we have to make a request. So we'll call this request equals and it's fetch requests. Don't worry so much about what this line does. It's just making a request for getting our entity. So book. And then we can basically perform this fetch. So we'll do let books equals try context.fetch, and then pass in the request. And this returns an array of books. And so what we can do is we can do for book in books. We can print the so before we print the title, we have to get the title. So we can do for books in book. We can do let title equal book.value for key title, and then print that title. Not forcing around that. Cool. So now if we run this code, we should see that catching the rye prints to our terminal. And it does. Great. So I know that went fast there. But basically what we did was, we get our object context used to access core data. We create a new entity, update the context or save the context. And then to get any data back from core data, we make a request, fetch that request, and then it returns, an array of objects that we can iterate through and access those values. I think I'm running pretty close to time here. So to wrap things up, that's pretty much it. We covered user defaults, keychain, the file system, key lists, and core data. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions about persistence, about applying to app dev, about apps in industry, feel free to come up to me after lecture and we can talk. But aside from that, I will pass it to Alden and Elvis.